So I've been a long-term fan of Jerry's work, and two strands in particular have been of interest to me. So one is unpicking the global and intimate, and the other, of course, is collaborative research, or PAR. And I think, one of the things that the book shows really nicely is how the two work together, and that those particular methodologies and approaches to research are kind of really great ways for unpicking the global and the intimate. So I've been asked to speak about intimacy and violence, which I'm really happy to do, and this sort of relates closely to some work that I've been doing recently as well. And of course, violence is always intimate. That's sort of one of the key messages of the book for me. But I also throughout I was reflecting about what intimacy is, and the ways in which intimacy, in every case of intimate violence is intimate, it's always working through emotion. So I'll say a little bit about emotion. And then I guess my ending point is whether or not intimacy is a kind of, whether it's just sort of too limited as a concept. Jerry encourages us to see violence as always intimate, which is a kind of, a sort of long-term feminist project over, 4 decades, although, not necessarily explicitly stated in that way. So global violence is as intimate, and intimate violence is kind of taking place simultaneously on other scales. So violence is embedded in intimacy. It's produced through intimacy, and it has effects that are always experienced intimately. And this is all happening at wider spatial scales at the same time. And that violence against people who experience marginality, whether it's through gender, ethnicity, nationality, age, disability, sexuality, the reason it works so well and also so silently is precisely because of this kind of double or triple embedding in multiple places and scales at the same time. Now, of course, just a quick plug, this is, of course, is the theme of our workshop on Thursday, which is on the intimate geopolitics of violent insecurities, which you must come to, and Jerry's very kindly agreed to come along and speak at that as well. And what I think the book really does for me is it illustrates in really sophisticated ways the collapsing of all of those divides that are commonly drawn, and as geographers we're sort of constantly criticising these binaries, and yet in many ways our work on violence is also constantly reinscribing them. And the book really works to disrupt that. So Jerry talks about in the introduction a continuum of violence, which, and I'm not sure if you draw that, Jerry, partly from Liz Kelly's work in the 1980s, which is a kind of a feminist conceptualisation of sexual violence on a continuum, and she means that in two senses. So one is the basic common character that underlies different sorts of violence, abuse and coercion and force, particularly against women. That is a kind of a standard across cultures. But secondly, seeing violence as a series of elements or events that merge and can't be distinguished. And what this does is really usefully is it allows us to make links between different sorts and scales of violence globally, which of course is exactly what Jerry's doing in the book. So Jerry's analysis of violence and intimacy is intertwined. It works through a framing, which for me is all about emotion. So intimacy, and we can think about intimacy not just as liberating, but also as tyrannical. It works through emotion. And I want to just sort of quickly discuss that in two ways. So first of all, how using this framing of intimacy points us to how violence already has effects through emotion. So that's how it does its work, not through the kind of physical aspects, but always already through emotions. But then secondly, what the book really usefully draws out is how intimacy can also be part of the answer. So part of this ethical and political project that Jerry outlines. So establishing or working with intimacy through emotions. So I'll say a little bit about each of those, and then I do have a critical thought under each heading, but I have to say, they're not very critical thoughts because I love the book, so it's more like, as I said to Jerry earlier, sycophant meets author, really. So first of all, taking that point that each of the different forms of violence, I was trying to kind of draw out the various forms of violence within this book, and there's a lot. That's one of the reasons it works so well. And it has its effects through emotions. And none of them can actually work outside of that framing. So intimate abuse in the domestic sphere, first of all, and that might be within migrant families, It might be by employers against domestic workers. As we know, works through fear, so fear of harm, of personal harm, but also in this case of economic hardship for self and the implications for children's welfare and so on. Secondly, what Jerry calls the state terror in the Philippines, so all these sort of extrajudicial killings of human rights workers and members of the political left also work, and the book documents this in chapter 5 really well, through the creation of fear and tension. But also, as Jerry points out here, that fear is also a galvanising force resistance under certain conditions. And then thirdly, the key argument in the book of the living caregiver programme working as state violence itself. And this is both because of the material implications of the programme for women and their families and their children in particular, but also the emotional trauma that comes across so powerfully in the book. And of course, the important thing here is that the emotional trauma, it's not personal, it's not private, but it's distributed. So everybody involved in different places around the world is feeling this emotional trauma in different ways. And it also struck me that the emotions are working relationally, in that where there's emotional trauma for one set of actors, so the caregivers and families, it's intimately bound to, I guess, almost an opposite, which is the provision of emotional security for the employers and the mothers, the families. So security for the mothers and their children in Canada through this provision of valuable but also devalued at the same time care, so that it's culturally and economically comfortable for these mothers to leave their children. And I was really struck by the chapter in which Jerry juxtaposes the photographs of your own son with a caregiver's account of her relationship with her children. And you talk there about, so we leave our children in the global north for 9 hours, not 9 years, but it's still a leaving, okay? But it's a leaving that's made comfortable for white middle-class women in different ways. And then fourthly, so the fourth kind of main form of violence was the epistemic violence that Jerry talks about in the introduction of Western scholarship itself and the ways in which research is still generally done, and the impact of that on using third world women to kind of in a kind of acquisitive, competitive way that enhances academic careers, and of course the methodology here upturns that. And it's an emotional epistemic violence as well. So as Linda Tuhue Smith reminds us, there's a long-standing and deep-seated collective emotional wounds among certain researched communities. And it puts in mind for me as well the chapter that Jerry wrote with the Women's Centre and the Youth Centre on what she calls faux pas, that's P-A-R, not P-A-S, and the damage that kind of research can do if done misguidedly. So the quick thought I had here was about the framing of affect, and I was sort of really interested in the ways that Jerry sort of starts with affect, and the book becomes more about perhaps emotion more generally, but using a specific conceptualization of affect as a possible medium, particularly for circulating feeling and mobilizing action with. So not through pity for, but through action with, which is a quite different thing. And I guess I did feel a small moment of affective discomfort when this is introduced in the book. So going from recent geographical work on affect and then critiquing that, so covering some of the stuff that Divya Tolya-Kelly's talked about in this department, about universalism, the tendency to erase race, if it's understood outside its historicised and politicised context. And then moving on to Sarah Ahmed's work, but adding on stuff around the spatialities of affect and using affect as a resource for hope and action for both Canadians and Filipinos. So as the book progresses, as I've outlined, the framing of emotion is really a felt and a cognitive process, and it's kind of really interesting for me to think about that interplay. And it brings to mind feminist work on emotion, which is framed as really politicised and wholly inhabited by bodies and minds, and not only of the subjects of our research, but also our own, and putting our own lives and activism into that. Okay, so the second bit about intimacy, again working through emotion, is I guess the sort of key theme in the ending of the book, as Lucy said, as an answer to all forms of violence. So this is the political project that Jerry outlines and is already enacting herself, so not as a distant scholar in any way. And here I read intimacy in, first of all, the representations, so the theatre, the photography, the testimonials, as a way for Canadians to make intimate connections with the domestic workers' experiences, but with the unrecognised as well as the familiar. So that's the challenge. And then secondly, the chapter on intimacy and witnessing state violence in the Philippines, on practising cosmopolitan interestedness. So again, making relations, making realities in different places visible, in this case realities that are very far away. Feeling and listening is central to this process. And then thirdly, intimacy as a kind of, we need to be careful about this, but as a response to the epistemic violence of research. So feminist activist collaborative research, which is really epitomised in the book, is not just about establishing good relations and letting emotion and affect do its work, but Jerry in particular has done a lot here and elsewhere to alert us to the real hard labour of working with difference, rather than it kind of being easy and cuddly, and it's always nice. And I guess, the last few years I've taken great heart from that acknowledgement, which we don't always see. So there's a major theme there of recognition of others and the intimacy of violence. That violence is already here, it's already with us, it's at home, inside for us and others, and that's a really necessary recognition for change to take place. So then my second little thought, which I guess I've been sort of grappling with in my own work recently, is when we think about intimacy in this way, actually it becomes something else and it's no longer intimacy, right? And I wonder, is it useful perhaps to think about extimacy as well as or instead of intimacy? So intimacy concerns private and personal emotions of the self, which might become shared between people who are usually close, and spatially close as well. And of course, I think we need to face the issue that constructs of intimacy and privacy are also really dangerous constructs, and particularly for women. So with domestic violence, I was kind of thinking about Rhonda Hammer's critiques of the ideology imbued in language about domestic violence. How can we talk about domestic violence with a horrible kind of medicalised word, intimate partner violence, and get away from that ideology? Because a lot of those terms imply parity between partners, but also calling it intimate limits the scope of its causation and our responses to it, and set it as a family problem rather than one within context of patriarchy, colonisation and globalisation. So in our work with Scottish Women's Aid that I'm involved in at the moment, we're calling domestic violence everyday terrorism, because it allows us to bring the outside in. It allows us to talk about the ways that domestic violence is already public and spectacular. We don't need to make it that, but we can do something perhaps to draw attention to that and increase recognition. And also getting to this idea of extimacy in relation to different forms of global gendered violences. There's a recent book by, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Bahan Radunovic and Rajan, called Violence and Gender in the Globalised World, the Intimate and the Extimate. So extimacy, it's not an opposite to intimacy, but it acknowledges the presence of what is other at the place thought to be most intimate. It's already there. It describes phenomena that defy this inside-outside, self-other boundary, and are both exterior and intimate at the same time, so rejecting that common kind of psychic division. So it's a way of thinking about how personal issues are also present in other spaces, and Paul Kingsbury in Geography has written about this, how our feelings can be radically externalised to others or objects, and particularly in other spaces. So describing the sharing of experiences or thoughts normally private and getting them into wider circulation, which is exactly Jerry's political and ethical agenda.